There we go. Pablo's there as well. Perfect. Good morning from Bahrain and good morning to all of our audience this morning. It's an absolute pleasure to be moderating yet another session for FinTech Robos. And I'm sure with everybody on the panel today is going to be both informative and exciting. This morning, we are extremely pleased from Bahrain to have the representatives from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, with us, speaking to the MENA region about the Pensions Outlook Report 2022. I'm honored to have thought leaders as yourselves with me to discuss the topic of pensions, because the OECD and FinTech Robos have been putting a massive amount of effort on this front to raise awareness and initiate change in this arena. Ladies and gentlemen in the audience today, my name is Nurhan Alban and I will be your moderator for the rest of the session. Before we kick off, I want to take a minute to introduce the valued speakers that we have on the panel with us today. Mr. Pablo Antolin is the Principal Economist, Head of the Private Pensions Unit, and Deputy Head of the OECD Consumer Finance, Insurance and Pensions Division. Good morning, Mr. Pablo.
Good morning. So should I go ahead? Okay, well, hello everybody. It's a pleasure for me and for all of us from the OECD to be here today to present the OECD Pensions Outlook that was launched on December last year. And the first thing I always like to do is to thank the audience for being here and for giving us the opportunity to do so, to present the Pensions Outlook. The key issue of the Pension Outlook is to send the message that strengthening pension reform in the face of global crisis is still an important goal. We believe it's not time to pause. We understand that there are many short-term issues that and concerns that weigh a lot today, like many of you know, inflation and economic growth and other issues, but saving for retirement is for the long term. It's a very long-term undertaking, and that needs a well-designed and regulated pension arrangements. And what we do in the Pensions Outlook in different editions is to provide or to address different issues on how to tackle this long-term goal. Let me now put share my presentation to highlight the key issues. Display settings. So here is the main pension outlook. Well, the cover of the pensions outlook, and one key issue we highlight is that pension assets have been growing quite continuously for the last 21 years, which means that they have been pursuing their long-term trend despite all the events and shocks that we have experienced, like the financial crisis and the COVID-19 outbreak. So here we can see that asset back has been on the rise in most OECD countries. This provides us the assets earmarked for retirement. We only look at assets earmarked for retirement, not all assets that can be used, but the ones that are earmarked for retirement. And here we have it as a percentage of GDP in 2001. We can see that there were a few countries that was quite important, but there were in most countries there were. What has happened in the last 2 decades? Well, basically that it has grown enormously in all OECD countries, and now it represents more than 100% in 9 OECD countries, more than 100% of GDP. These are countries like Australia, Canada, Denmark, Iceland, Netherlands, Switzerland, Sweden, the UK, and the United States. But what is the key message that we have here? Well, it is important to continue the reforms to improve those asset-backed pension arrangements, as I mentioned. But we have been seeing is that it has been a growth in pension arrangements where assets back pension benefits. And this has contributed in most OECD countries to a multi-pillar system, which is one of the key messages of the OECD. And they are here, and they have been designed, they have been introduced to complement, not to substitute, public pay-as-you-go pension arrangements. And this is very important because it is important to have a multi-pillar pension system in which each of the components complement each other. This is one of the issues we talk in one of the previous editions of the Pension Outlook. Also, having a multi-pillar system with asset-backed pension arrangements and other type of arrangements complemented each other allows for diversifying the sources to finance retirement. And this, again, is a key message from the OECD on how to build resilient pension system. And this is the last point, that they have permitted to many countries to have more resilient pension system. But of course, there are many issues that need to be tackled to continue making pension system more resilient and strengthening them in order to provide good retirement incomes. For example, improve retirement incomes and sustainability of retirement incomes from pensioners. And one of the chapters in the Pension Outlook that my colleague Jessica will be talking about deals with some of these issues. Also, making pension system more inclusive, considering all type of workers. And here, one of the key issues is to increase coverage, and chapter 2 that my colleague Stephanie will present looks at the potential role of employers in many pension arrangements to increase coverage and to provide pension arrangements in a more inclusive way. Also, from our point of view, we have the OECD core principle of private pension regulation, which are key instrument to regulate all these asset-backed pension arrangements, and it's essential that they are well regulated. As well, we have the OECD recommendation for the good design of these pension plans. And again, this is a recommendation that provide guidelines to policymakers on how to design asset-backed pension arrangements in order to make them coherent, inclusive, and many other factors that we recommend over there. And finally, there is the issue of what is the role of pension funds as institutional investors in promoting and supporting sustainable growth and development. And this, it's in a publication. We have some work on that is in a publication that we launched it also at the end of last year, and I will mention it a little bit just at the end. But so what do we do in this pension outlook in this edition? Well, first, we look at how to introduce, develop, and strengthen asset-backed pension arrangements. And let me here say that everything we do is in coordination with pension regulators and pensions supervisors and insurance regulators and supervisors across OECD countries, and also from non-member countries that are part of the International Organization of Pension Supervisors. We learn from their experience, and we distill policy guidelines that we provide. Our goal is to provide these policy guidelines so policymakers understand the different choices they have, but most importantly, they understand that there is no one good policy. There are many options with their strengths and weaknesses, and what they choose, it depends on the starting point in the respective countries and the policy goals that they might have when they introduce, develop, and strengthen pension arrangements. As I say, the second chapter that Stephanie will present, it looks at how best to involve employers, the role of employers. The third one on how to establish different ways of charging fees. The fourth one, how to build mortality assumption and mortality tables to ensure the sustainability of lifetime retirement income. And the fifth one, which also my colleague Jessica will be presenting, in how to design non-guaranteed lifetime retirement income arrangements. Let me now quickly focus on chapter 1, how to introduce, develop, and strengthen asset-backed pension arrangements. In this chapter, basically, we pose 3 key questions and develop 3 areas. First, what countries need or might need to consider ahead of introducing or reforming asset-backed pension arrangements, what we call the planning. The second part is the challenges and the policy consideration that arise during the implementation phase of the reform. First, we have the planning. Secondly, we have the implementation. And the third stage is the consideration that policymakers might take on board when they are maintaining and strengthening the already existing asset-backed pension arrangements once they are in place, what we call the monitoring. And here we have a few issues that are quite important to bear in mind in each of these three stages. On the planning, it's very important to have adequate institutional and legal structures in place. If they are not in place, it's very difficult to introduce asset-backed pension arrangements like any policy in any country in the world. Governance, regulation, and supervisor framework needs to be set up with issues like fit and proper independence with a clear mandate and issues and mechanisms to address conflict of interest. On the supervision structure, there are many ways of implementing. You can have a specialized supervisions like in Australia and Chile, or you can have integrated within other authorities like in many European countries. Also, it's important to manage the potential risk that might come about with incomplete capital markets and also with inflation, a key issue nowadays. It's also to put and to have mechanism in place to protect assets, because at the end of the day, the assets are the element that is going to finance retirement. So all the issues involving insolvency legislation, ring-fenced retirement savings, and to enforce independent audit mechanisms become extremely important. And of course, anything about reforming, in particular pensions, requires good communication, because it's important to build support for change. What is the reform is for? Build trust, establish independent inquiries, national communication campaign, public awareness campaigns. The key thing is that people understand what is this for, how it's going to affect them, and build trust that the reform is here in the best interest of people. On the implemented sides, it's very important to make clear that regulators and supervisors have the right operation, powers, and function in place. Issues like personal identification system and accounts, IT, digitalization, the staff, and the collaboration between the different agencies. Licensing requirements and procedures are very important. Cybersecurity, the whole issue of how to structure, how to establish contribution collection, record keeping, data reporting, digitalization through government agencies, tax authorities, pension providers. There are many mechanisms in many countries. We explain that in detail in the chapter. And of course, what is the cost of the reform and the financing, and how to communicate all of this to individuals. Individuals need to understand. And for that, clear, simple messages, support for people to make choices, different distribution channels, tailor messages to audiences, control the narrative of the reform, avoid messages that could lead to unrealistic expectations, communicate all the different default choices that exist and how they have been achieved and what are the purpose of these defaults. And of course, it's also, as Stephanie will raising his presentation, communication to employers, because they need to understand the role. And finally, on monitoring, the third stage, once these arrangements are in place, they need to be strengthened, because nothing is good forever. The world keeps changing, and the systems like asset-backed pension systems need to adjust, change, improve, and object to the new objectives and the changes that happen. And this is very important. And of course, we learn as we go along. So address shortcoming governance as it comes along is quite important. Let's keep in things issues like ESG investment. Well, the skill and knowledge of governing body might change because ESG sustainable investment was not here 10, 20 years ago, but now it's here. We have the issue of master trust and multi-employer systems. This is new, also to some degree. So there are changes and adjustments to implement to take into account all the issues of diversity and potential conflict of interest. And of course, we know in many countries there are mergers and consolidations because of the small size problems, reaching efficiency, but one needs to take into account potential monopoly power after central threshold, learning about the tipping point, it changes from different countries. So all these adjustments and addressing the shortcomings are important to keep in mind. Systems evolve, system needs to adjust. And of course, implement measures to improve investment performance, loosen investment restriction, nudge people away from guarantees, foster competition, looking at both the supply and demand side, align fees with the service provider, and of course, take into account that members might have preferences from ESG. But here, the risk management processes become important and needs to be adjusted again for sustainable and ESG investment, internal control, and take into account that we are moving from a world of investment limited to risk-based assessments. Consumer protection have become very important. We need to take into account regulation of the product design and marketing, regulation of financial advice, consumer education, and financial literacy programs. This we can talk here for hours, but we address these issues in the chapter. And again, we need to address potential loss of trust. People might lose sight of that this is for the best interest of them, of members of the population, and we need to continue develop communication programs, tailored campaigns to connect more directly with individuals. This has to be constant through the whole process. It's not something that you do today and you can sleep in your laurels. There are many issues that continue coming along. And finally, to finish, there are many challenges ahead. We will be talking about these issues, how to use assets earmarked for retirement to contribute to sustainable investment, incorporating ESG risk and factor in the investment strategies of pension fund, the idea of mortality assumption, mortality tables, and the impact of COVID, that those three issues we assess in a publication I'm going to show now, the idea of emergency funds, the whole issue of digitalization, and of course, I'm happy to talk later about the potential impact of inflation that needs to be taken on board. But in the publication on the right, we do talk, and this one came out also at the end of last year, we also talk about how to strengthen asset-backed pension arrangements in a post-COVID, the use of asset earmark for retirement, and also how mortality might have impact. Mortality might have, the COVID-19 might have impact mortality and mortality assumption. But I now leave the floor to my colleagues to continue with the developing in more detail of the different chapters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pablo. I was having a little bit of a technical issue when we kicked off, so I wasn't able to introduce all the speakers essentially as we would. And now we have an increasing audience, so I'm going to take that ground here. Just to give a background to the audience joining, we're going to be running through the presentation. So Pablo ran his first presentation. We're going to have every chapter of the ones where the authors are on the screen to share their views on their presentation as well. Can I please guide the audience that if they have any questions, they can post them in the chat or the Q&A section, and I will be taking them and asking them as we go. Now, Pablo, I wanted to ask you this question at the start, but you made very good references of these questions or these elements in your presentation already. So if I can take you back a step and kind of ask you to lay the ground for us on a big picture in terms of from the research that you and the team have been going and everything that's been happening on the economy, what's really been the big movers when we speak about pensions globally in terms of maybe the economy or demographics or so on? It can be like a brief intake, but I just wanted to lay the ground for our audience this morning.
Well, obviously, you mentioned one important one that has been a big mover everywhere and also led to the realization of one of the issues I highlight, which is creating a multi-pillar system in which asset-backed pension arrangements complement and develop public pension, which is demographics. Obviously, the demographic works has an impact on pay-as-you-go public pensions and also on private pensions and asset-backed pensions. But the mechanisms through which it works is different, and the issues that raises is different. So that's why it's very important to have both to complement each other and to have the synergies of the positive aspects of each of them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And about your chapter 1, you've discussed a couple of very valuable points. I wanted to ask a few questions around those, if you'd allow me. So the first part of the report, which I read quite deeply, you were referring to the importance of licensing and structuring and the changes of the regulatory scene, especially now that we are seeing changes around ESG, cybersecurity, and so on. So from the OECD experience, has there anything or any particular country or any particular model that has stood out? So I have heard you refer to Australia and Chile and maybe others, but in terms of a regulatory framework, do we have like a benchmark that we can look at?
As I tried to say at the beginning, there is not a benchmark for that you can say, well, this is the country that everybody should follow, because as I say, the starting point of each country is going to determine the options available. And of course, the objective that the country has with reforms or with developing this type of pension arrangements are also to weigh heavily on where to go and what example of developing in the past might be a good guide with their strengths and weaknesses, obviously, because there is nothing perfect. So the starting point and the objectives are going to determine. So I cannot give you an answer, oh, this is the best, if I don't have what is the starting point, so what country we're talking about, and what are the objectives that policymakers have in their mind.
Okay, so it's more like of a customized basis depending on where each region is.
Exactly.
Stunning. Also, kind of in the mid part of your presentation, you made a reference to high inflation, right? Which is the conversation that the entire world has been speaking about for a while. And so essentially, you've also referred to the importance of having strong capital markets, which in the GCC or in the region where we're at, this is really the focus of the regulators to build the capital markets. So in the light that perhaps there aren't very strong capital markets, and in the light that there may be a lack of investment options or high inflation risk, if you can share any insights around the findings in your report around how to hedge these risks, or perhaps how to mitigate them, or areas that we've seen development on those fronts.
Well, a standard investment theory suggests that equities to some degree will incorporate hedging for inflation. Of course, we also know that in some countries there exists inflation index government bonds to do all of that. The important thing for us with inflation is to understand not how we are not expert on investments. So there are people who their entire life is about investment. So I leave for them this kind of answers. But what is important for us as policy analysts is to understand what is the potential impact of inflation on the asset side and on the liability side, also on active members, saving, and also on retirees. And this depends enormously on the type of design that different countries have. Are benefits indexed to inflation? In some countries, they are indexed to inflation. Are we talking about the public pension system, or are we talking about asset-backed pension arrangements? Are we talking about whether there are links to wage growth or not in the contribution to inflation? So we have a lot of issues to give a simple answer right now. We will have to have a session just on that.
I know, which is kind of where I'm gutting for. So basically, I'm trying to bring you in so we can have more sessions with you. But thank you so much for your answers, Pablo. That was very insightful. I'm going to try to park most of my questions at the end so we make sure that all the presentations are covered, and also encouraging the audience to share their questions on the chat. I'd now like to welcome Mrs. Stephanie Payet, who is the policy analyst in the private pension unit of the OECD and the author of one of the chapters in the Pensions Outlook report, to share her presentation about the work that she's done. Ms. Stephanie, please.
Thank you very much, Nuran. So let me know if you can see. Can you see the slides in full?
Can see the slides, but not in full. Yes, now it is. Perfect.
Great, thank you. So good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to make this presentation of the second chapter of the OECD Pensions Outlook that was released last year. And this is about the role of employers in the provision of asset-backed pension arrangements. And the reasons why we look at this issue is because we observe that across countries, the role of employers in the provision of asset-backed pension arrangements can be very different from one country to the next. It can be mandatory or voluntary system. It can be relying on employers to set up a pension plan or having just employers making contributions. So we wanted to understand the different models of using employers, of involving employers, and what could be the best way to involve employers. And to do that, we first analyzed the current employer involvement in the OECD countries. And before providing policy guidance, we wanted to understand what can be the motivations for employers to be involved in the provision of asset-backed pension arrangements, and also what can be the advantages and the challenges associated with having this employer. So, as I said, we first look at the current employer involvement in OECD countries. And we saw that there is a very wide range of roles that employers can play in the different pension systems. They can establish a pension plan for their employees. They can design this pension plan. They can select the provider or even establish the financial entity that will be the pension fund. They can enroll all the eligible employees into the pension plan. They can channel the contributions of employees into the plan and make themselves employer contributions. Sometimes they administer the plan, and they have also usually a communication role. And basically, depending on the type of plan that the different countries have, the mix of roles that employers will have is different. The model or the type of plan with the least involvement from employers is with statutory personal pension plans. And in those plans, basically the employer is mostly responsible for the contribution, so channeling the employee contribution and making themselves contributions, and sometimes some information role about what is the plan about. And the higher degree of employer involvement will be with occupational pension plan, where more or less all the roles that I've listed here in this slide will fall on the shoulder of the employer. And of course, some countries mandate employers to do a number of these roles, while in some of the countries it's only voluntary for employers to enter into this involvement, into these roles. And what we can see is that actually today many OECD countries rely heavily on employers to establish occupational pension plans and to contribute to asset-backed pension arrangements. So if we look at the graph on the left, is the proportion of assets in each country in occupational, DB and DC plans and in personal pension plans. And actually in 10 OECD countries, the assets held in occupational pension plans represent more than 50% of the total assets of all the plans in the country. And if you look at the right, the graph on the right, you have how much the employer contributes as a percentage of the total contributions paid in a given country. And you see that in most countries, employers pay at least half of the total contributions. And in 11 countries, they even pay 70% of the total contribution. So it's a very significant role for employers is to establish occupational pension plans in a number of countries, and very important role of employer contributions. So what can be the motivations for employers to be involved in all of this? Well, the first motivation is actually to attract and retain employees. This is something that there are a number of studies showing that employees value pensions as part of the remuneration package. So employers offering pension plans will be able to attract and retain employees. And also there are studies showing that because employees are more satisfied with their employer through the provision of a pension plan, it will increase their satisfaction with the employer and reduce employee turnover rate. So thereby for the employer, what is good here is that they can reduce the hiring and training costs. And also because the employers in occupational pension plans, they can adjust the design to their needs. They can also attract the employees that have specific characteristics that will match the need that they have for their company business. And as I said, it's important to look at the advantages and also the challenges associated with employee involvement before providing any kind of recommendation. So on the plus side, what are the advantages of involving employers? Well, the employers can tailor the plan design to the preferences of their employees. For example, if you have a pension plan for nurses, it will likely have different design than a pension plan for people in the banking industry. So having employers involved allows to have this tailoring based on the characteristics and preferences of the employees. Employers can also simplify a number of decisions that employees would otherwise have to do if it was in a pure personal pension context. For example, the employer can select the pension provider, so it's not a decision that needs to be done by the employee. The employer can deduct and channel employee contributions. They can also contribute on behalf of employees. And these payroll deductions are very powerful because basically the employee don't need to think about it. The contributions are paid automatically to the pension plan. The employer may also bear or share the investment and longevity risks, for example, through DB pension schemes, defined benefit pension schemes, although we know that the tendency is to move away from defined benefit and more towards defined contribution or risk-sharing arrangements. The employer can also be involved in the good governance of the pension plans. They can, for example, nominate representatives in the governing bodies of the pension plan. And one important aspect of this good governance is to actually keep costs and fees under control, because the employers want a good, cost-efficient pension plan. Otherwise, they would select another way to remunerate their employees. So they really want to make sure that the pension plan is run in a cost-effective way. So that's why good governance and keeping costs and fees under control is one big advantage of having employers being involved. They can also implement behavioral strategies. We have seen in a number of countries that employers have been the ones testing new strategies such as automatic enrollment, matching contributions, or automatic escalation of contributions. And all of these are very good ways to increase savings from employees. And finally, employers can provide financial education, and there are a number of studies showing that workplace financial education can be effective in increasing savings from employees. But obviously, it's not only advantages, there are also challenges related to employer involvement in provision of asset-backed pensions. The first observation we have is that when you look at the data across countries, you can see that, so it's in the chapter, that participation rates can be sometimes very low in voluntary occupational systems. The reasons for that is that participation in a voluntary occupational system requires two steps. First step is that the employer is willing to establish a pension plan. And once a pension plan is established by the employer, the second step is that the employees actually are willing to join that plan. So first, there are some barriers that may prevent employers to establish a pension plan. Employers may be concerned over the business profitability of the company and therefore be afraid to commit for the long term that pensions imply. Employers may think that the cost is too high for them, and they may feel that the administrative burden is too big, and that running a pension plan would distract them from doing their own business. And all these barriers are particularly important for the smaller employers. For them, the barrier is even harder to go through. And even when an employer establishes a pension plan for the employees, it doesn't mean that automatically the employees will all join it when it's voluntary participation. There may be a lack of interest from employees and behavioral biases that explain that employees actually do not want to join that plan. And sometimes also it's because there is a misalignment of interest between the employees and the employers. An example of such a misalignment is the use of vesting periods. Employers may want to have vesting periods, meaning that they may want that the employee stays in the company for a number of years before they can earn the employer contribution fully. So that is understandable from the employer perspective, but from the employee perspective, if they don't know how long they are going to stay with this employer, it may just discourage them from joining the pension plan altogether. Some employees may also be worried that if the employer becomes insolvent, then they will lose part of their future pension. There also is an issue with small funds when you have a lot of small employers, and each of those small employers establishing their own pension plan. Then you have the issue that those small pension funds don't have the scale and therefore tend to have higher fees and charges. And also the governance can be a problem in these small pension funds. And finally, the workers in non-standard forms of work may have more limited access to employer-sponsored pension plans. For example, self-employed people, but they don't have an employer to offer them a pension, access to a pension plan. But we can think also of part-time employees and temporary employees. They usually have lower or more difficult access to occupational pension plans due to eligibility criteria to join those plans. So now that we understand what are the motivations for employers to be involved in the provision of those plans and what can be the advantages and the challenges, we can think of how to optimize employee involvement depending on the needs of each country. And the first thing is that the countries need to select the most appropriate degree of employee involvement. We have seen that depending on the type of plan, you can have a different mix of the roles for the employer involvement. And to select the most appropriate degree of employee involvement, you need to account for the structure and the mobility of the labor force. For example, do you have a lot of self-employed in the labor force? And then in that case, that means you cannot rely fully on employer provision because all those self-employed will be left out. Mobility is also important because it will drive how you will design the occupational pension system so that people who shift employment a lot will be able to have portable pension plans. It is also important to ensure good conditions for employer provision, so having stable legal, regulatory, and tax framework. So the employer, when they consider having a pension plan, they know what will be the long-term commitment and the long-term rules of the game. And it's also important to have well-functioning capital markets and financial institutions because, as I said earlier, the employers will want to have cost-efficient pension plans. So and this requires good capital markets and financial institutions. We've seen that there are some barriers that may prevent employers from establishing pension plans. So there are ways to reduce those barriers by reducing the cost and administrative burden, especially for small employers. For example, in the US, there is a special tax credit for small employers establishing a pension plan. Another idea to reduce barriers, to reduce the cost, is to develop multi-employer pension plan because then the responsibilities, a lot of the responsibilities around establishing and administering the pension plan is moved from the employer to a third party, which can be the social partners, for example, which have much more knowledge also for doing this administration. And some of the barriers are also related to the lack of flexibility. And so, for example, when you have large crises such as the COVID-19, some countries provided flexibility regarding the payment of the contribution. So that can reassure employers that eventually, if there is a big crisis, some flexibility will be provided, although it needs to be also weighted against future pension adequacy issues. It's still important to allow employers to tailor the design of the plan to their needs and to the needs of their employees, but this needs to be part of a framework that ensures non-discriminatory treatment across different categories of employees, meaning that as to the extent possible, eligibility criteria based on earnings, working hours, or type of contracts should be eliminated to allow all types of employees to join occupational pension plans. Employer can also be used to improve financial literacy, and there are some countries that encourage employers to use behavioral strategies to foster participation and savings, such as encouraging employers to provide automatic enrollment or matching contributions or even automatic escalation of contributions. And although it's not easy for employers to provide financial education, there are some countries that actually help employers a lot to facilitate this provision because, again, financial education in the workplace is seen to have a good impact. And the final point is to ensure good governance, ensuring that there is a good framework for that. For example, making sure that the people in the governing bodies have the required skills and that the conflict of interest can be mitigated. So thank you very much for your attention and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for sharing that presentation. I think the role of employers, especially on this side of the world, is something that we are really trying to see a lot of improvement when it comes to it. Now, just to lay some ground for the audience, because I know you referred to it, you swept through it, but I want to lay some ground. So you basically referred to a general move from defined benefit to defined contribution. So if you could briefly explain for us the difference and essentially let us understand why, from your opinion, you see that there is a move or a shift.
Yeah, so sorry, maybe I should have provided the broad definition that we use. So in the defined, so occupational pension plans, so those plans that are established and offered by employers, can be divided between two categories, two extreme categories, let's say, because there are things in the middle. But on the one side, you have defined benefit pension plans where the employer guarantees either a certain return on your contributions or directly guarantees a certain benefit level based on a formula that is using the number of years you've been with the employer and the salary. And so all the risk related to investments and also potentially the risk related to longevity is borne fully by the employer. At the other extreme, you have defined contribution pension schemes where the only commitment of the employer is to pay defined contribution. So contributions can be like a fixed nominal amount, or it can be a percentage of your salary. So this is the only commitment that is done. And so that means that all the risks related to investment and longevity are borne by the employees. And here you can already see why there is this shift. With Pablo mentioned the evolution of demographics, with population aging, the design of defined benefit pension plans has been very rigid, meaning that the employers have been unable to change the formulas, and therefore there have been a lot of cases where the employers have had to put extra contributions to make sure that the pension plan will be able to pay the future benefits to the employees and to the future retirees. So basically, employers wanted to remove this uncertainty over the contributions that we'll have to pay for the plan, and they prefer the certainty of defined contribution where they know exactly what it costs.
Understood. Thank you. So if I can take this question up another level, if you allow me. Okay. So if I put myself as an employee who works for a firm who provides an occupational pension scheme, and they went down the route that they're going to do a defined contribution, right? So A, I'm getting my salary from that organization, and B, I'm depending on my pension. Let's say I didn't have another alternative. So here in Bahrain, we have the government that provides that support. But let's say I was depending fully on the employer. Now, in terms of that element of risk for me and for my kind of protection of my assets as I retire, what would be your views around that? I know you referred to it briefly as being a risk, but now if I couple defined contribution with the element of depending on my employer, what could be the risks that you see there, or how can perhaps I as a household can protect myself?
Yeah, so first is a very theoretical example, because there is no country where the state is not involved at all in some sort of provision. So you will always have a fallback, at least from the state. But let's say that your occupational pension plan is the main source of your future retirement income. Well, the risk is that is first of all, the investment risk. If you put all your contributions in equities, you may have very good returns in the long term. But as you approach retirement, you also increase the risk of losing a lot of those assets. So there are a number of things that the employer can do actually to help you choose your investment strategy. There are a number of countries where the employer actually selects a subsample of a subset of investment strategies for you to choose from. And in a number of countries also, the regulator, the supervisor, imposes that the default investment strategy for those who are really not willing to make a choice because they are not investment experts, they don't want to do this type of decision. So the regulator would say, the default investment strategy would be, for example, a life cycle investment strategy. And the idea of a life cycle investment strategy is that as you approach retirement, your exposure to risky assets is going down. So you avoid losing a big part of your pot as you approach retirement. And then when talking about the other risk is also the mortality risk. And there, Jessica is actually going to talk more about the payout phase and how you can share also the mortality risk in order to mitigate this.
Thank you, Stephanie. It seems that your employer discussion has nudged our audience to start sending you questions, all right? So I'm going to start with one that came from Nasser. And Nasser is actually asking you, he said, like, you shared figures and assets on your presentation, that you were basically talking about how private pensions are going to continue to grow. But his question is, in terms of public pension funds, they're actually showing an actuarial deficit versus the growth of the private pension side. So what's that telling us about the future of the pension industry?
So the thing is, yes, there are a number of countries where the sustainability of the public pension system is a little bit, sorry, at risk. Let's put it that way. And a number of countries are actually doing a lot of reforms to improve the sustainability of pay-as-you-go pension system. And one of the ways of addressing this, and Pablo mentioned it, is the importance of the complementarity between the pay-as-you-go public systems and the private asset-backed pension system. So a number of countries have somehow reduced the entitlements that you can build through your public pension. This reduction can be actually by increasing the retirement age somehow. And to complement this, they have built up asset-backed pensions to make sure that when people have both sources of retirement income, they will be good in retirement.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. There are a couple of questions that came in lined up as well. I think you've really triggered a very sensitive point. But what I'm going to do, if you allow me, I'm going to ask Jessica to do her presentation so we can make sure that we have enough time. And then we're going to come back and I'll make sure I address all the questions. So I'm asking my audience to keep sending me the questions on the chat, and we'll make sure we have Stephanie back with the employer questions in a bit. Thank you very much, Stephanie. I'd now like to welcome Miss Jessica Mosher, who is also an author of this report and is a policy analyst in the private pension unit of the OECD. Miss Jessica, we're very excited to hear your insights on the chapter that you presented.
Thank you. I'm just looking to share my screen now.
Please do. While you do, may I also tell the audience that I discovered that Jessica is actually an actuary, which blew me away, because by that, is Stephanie also a actuary? Because that would be cool. But this is the first woman actuary that I meet, so.
Sorry, I don't find, I've shared on Teams before, but it doesn't appear, my presentation doesn't appear.
I do not think, maybe the team at FinTech Robos can just make sure
they can,
Jessica has the right to share.
my presentation, because I don't, it's not coming up. Oh, wait. I got it. There.
Yes, if you can make it a big screen for us, that would be perfect.
Great, is it good?
Yeah, over to you now.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've heard about developing a funded asset-backed pensions and the role of employers. So my presentation is going to really focus more on design, and specifically the design of arrangements that can protect individuals from outliving their assets in retirement, but for which the level of benefits is not guaranteed. So we're calling these types of arrangements non-guaranteed lifetime retirement income arrangements. And I know this is a really long and kind of boring title, but we're calling it this to have a more of a common understanding of what we're talking about, because this category of plans really includes a lot of different types of plans. You've probably heard about collective defined contributions, CDC. This gets a lot of discussion in the UK and the Netherlands. There are target benefit plans in Canada, defined ambition plans, group self-annuitization. There's a lot of discussion around introducing modern tontines. So there's a lot of different types of plans, but the thing that this all has in common, and what we're trying to capture by referring to them as non-guaranteed lifetime retirement income arrangements, is the fact that all of these plans can provide income for life. That is, they protect individuals from the longevity risk of outliving their assets. But the benefits can be adjusted in light of actual longevity and investment experience, so the benefits are not guaranteed. And there's increasing interest in these types of arrangements as a compromise between the two extremes that Stephanie so well described earlier. So on one hand, we have fully guaranteed plans like defined benefit plans, where the risks are fully borne by the provider. This involves an additional cost because those guarantees also have to be hedged, which involves investing typically in government bonds, so lower return assets. And they also can present sustainability concerns to the employer. As Stephanie mentioned, they're uncertain of how much contributions they're going to have to make to meet those guarantees. And on the other hand, we have the other extreme of individual defined contribution accounts. These are individuals. All of the risks are borne by the individual. And a lot of people are not well positioned to have the knowledge to bear those risks or make the necessary financial decisions that they need to make by managing their own account, their own pension account. So non-guaranteed lifetime income is really a solution that tries to address the downsides of both of these two extremes. So first, they can, because there are no guarantees, the assets can be invested to earn higher higher investment returns, expected investment returns, because they don't have to be hedged. Secondly, these arrangements pool the longevity risk of all of the members. So this protects individuals from outliving their own assets, because they're protected from that idiosyncratic longevity risk of spending down their own assets if they live beyond the average age. And finally, because these are managed collectively, these types of arrangements can make sure that, or can be arranged as such that individuals actually don't have to make any decisions at all. So the governing body is making the appropriate decisions in the best interest of members, and they don't have to make any decisions. They can save, and they get their retirement income, and they don't even have to choose how to invest or how to draw down. So this is quite an attractive solution, but there are many challenges to overcome for the design, introduction, and implementation, and that's what we're trying to really address in this report by looking at the OECD countries who have experience in trying to introduce these types of arrangements and learning from them in all stages of the development. So from how to design the arrangements, what needs to be in place for their introduction, their implementation, and finally their successful operation in the long term. So I'll discuss some of these issues in turn. I'll start off with design. We see there's a lot of confusion about how these plans work and what people mean when they refer to specific types of plans. And I think a lot of this is because there are so many different ways that they can be designed. So I think it's useful first to break down these plans into their different components and the different options that we have for their design. So first of all, they can play a role in the accumulation of retirement savings or solely be used as a solution for decumulation. The ownership rights can be defined collectively, so everything's managed together, or they can be based around individual accounts, so individual rights. The way benefits are defined can be more like defined benefit plans, so referencing salary, or they can be more like defined contribution plans, where the reference benefit is based on an expected return on the contribution made. Benefit adjustments. This is one of the most complex aspects of design, but a necessary one, because these plans all should have the capacity to adjust benefits in line with the assets available to finance them. So that's a key feature of these types of plans, but the benefit adjustment can be rather complex. If there's a mismatch in assets and expected liabilities, benefits can be adjusted immediately. Otherwise, there can be smoothing mechanisms incorporated to mitigate some of the volatility and share some of the investment risk across the cohorts as well. Optionality, this can also be a limited feature with respect to possibly limited withdrawals or death benefits as well. And there's a lot of different combinations that we can have when we combine these different features, but there's always going to be trade-offs in how we do that, and the appropriate design will really depend on the policy objectives that are prioritized. So, for example, there tends to be a trade-off with designs that aim to limit benefit volatility. So this involves bringing in some sort of smoothing mechanism that will share risk across cohorts, and the trade-off with objectives that aim more for intergenerational equity and transparency. So that often results in more volatility of benefits. So there is no single design that can meet all possible policy objectives. And we really need to think about which policy objectives we're prioritizing and choosing the most appropriate design to introduce. There's also some conditions that are necessary for the introduction of these types of plans. A lot of jurisdictions have had to introduce new legislation to allow for these plans to exist. This is because existing legislation can forbid the reduction of any benefits. So in order to allow a plan that by nature has the possibility of reducing benefits, new legislation is required. But it's important to balance the prescriptiveness and flexibility of that legislation. For example, this is to encourage the market to develop at a regular pace, because, for example, in Quebec, the regulators have decided to hold off and wait a bit for the market to develop before they develop more detailed regulations. But this has resulted in some regulatory uncertainty because the providers aren't sure how regulation is going to evolve, and that makes them somewhat reluctant to engage. So the market has been a bit slow to develop there. The requirements also should be coherent with the nature of non-guaranteed arrangements and not impede the main benefits from them. And one of these is really the higher expected income that they can provide because they're not providing guarantees. And some jurisdictions that tend to be rather risk averse, they've introduced requirements that make the plan hold significant capital solvency buffers to reduce the probability that benefits will be reduced. But this obviously reduces the upside that members can achieve from the benefits, from the higher returns. The application of existing rules may also need to be considered, for example, with respect to the use of prudent assumptions for the valuation of funding and the extent that those are used for deciding on benefit adjustments. Incentives is one of the biggest challenges that we've seen to get these types of arrangements running. And this is both from the provider's point of view as well from the individual's point of view. If we're taking a employer's point of view, for example, Stephanie was just describing a lot of the impediments for them to offer. They would probably prefer just to offer a defined contribution plan, quite simply because it's much more straightforward and easier to administer and operate than one of these types of plans. So where this has been successfully offered by an employer, this has really been an effort, a joint effort between the unions and employee representatives and the employers, where the employees recognize that defined benefit plans are not going to necessarily be sustainable in the long run, but they don't want to have all of these risks borne by themselves as they would with the DC plan. So this is the compromise to offer. It's a paternalistic compromise to offer a reasonable retirement income, but without the sustainability concerns from a provider point of view. However, where this is optional for individuals in a more personal pension context, there's also the challenge of the lack of incentives for individuals to join, and these types of plans face the same challenges as traditional annuity products, where individuals are really just reluctant to hand over their retirement savings for a product that will give them longevity protection because they're basically losing control of all of those assets. There's also a lot of practical challenges to overcome for the implementation of these plans. Ideally, you'll be able to build on existing institutional frameworks, particularly on admin systems. This is most challenging for countries who are moving from a collective plan to ones based around individual accounts. This is something the Netherlands is currently doing, and it's presenting a huge challenge, very expensive for them to update their administrative infrastructure to accommodate this. To the extent that existing plans are going to be converted to a non-guaranteed lifetime income arrangement, this needs to be done in a way that ensures fairness to the existing members and their current benefits accrued. So Iceland has recently done this, and in order to be fair to the existing members, they ensured that the deficit of the plan was fully funded. Netherlands is also trying to convert their existing plans, and they are trying to reorganize and reallocate the collective assets to individual accounts in a way that ensures fairness, and that is obviously quite a complex exercise. Because these arrangements pool risk and they rely on pooling longevity risk, they also need to have sufficient scale for that mechanism to be effective. This can be an additional impediment for smaller providers or employers to be able to offer these plans to their employees. And finally, strong governance and effective communication are really crucial to ensure the successful long-term operation of these plans. Participants should be represented in the governance of the arrangement. They are the ones bearing the risk. They should be aware and have a say in how they're treated in the plan. Assumptions need to be established in a robust and independent manner, and benefit adjustments need to be transparent. Ideally, the rules in place to adjust benefits need to be defined, clearly defined in advance, so there's no room for playing with that. Effective communication. This is one of the most challenging aspects as well. These plans tend to be rather complex and difficult for people to understand how they work and how benefits can be adjusted. So they will probably involve significant educational initiatives, not only for the members, but also for the providers, to get them to understand how the plans work and the potential benefits from them. And of course, individuals also need to understand that their benefits can be reduced if that trigger is reached. If they don't understand this and the benefits are reduced, that really causes a huge trust problem in the system and could undermine the trust, individuals' trust in the pension system. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to discuss with additional questions. Thank you.
Well done, Jessica. Thank you for your presentation. Now, again, I like to base the ground with a very basic question. So right at the get-go, you said that benefits in the scheme that you are proposing, so the non-guaranteed scheme, are adjustable. So essentially, they are not guaranteed in the essence of the sentence. What can trigger an adjustment? And additionally, what kind of adjustment are you referring to, basically?
Yeah, so adjustments, the plans, the basis of the plans are really to ensure that they're sustainable, and so that the amount of assets available are always going to be sufficient to finance the contributions, the benefit levels for life. And so if investment returns have been lower than expected and assets are no longer sufficient, then that can trigger a benefit adjustment downward. Alternatively, if they've been higher, then that can allow for an increase in benefit levels. Similarly with the longevity, if people are living much longer than expected on average, that can also trigger a benefit reduction, because then they would have paid more benefits than they were planning on. So it's really just a comparison of the assets available and the expected present value of future pension payments, and where there's a mismatch, then that can trigger an adjustment.
So essentially, if I were to live longer, I'd get paid less.
Not necessarily. It's if you would get paid less if everyone lives longer. So it's really it's making the distinction between your own longevity risk. So this is what we're trying to address with these plans. They still protect you from outliving beyond the average, as long as the population in the plan still has an average life expectancy of what you're planning on. So if we're planning on everyone living to 85 on average, if you live to 90 and someone else only lives to 80, then you're still in balance, basically.
Makes sense. So it really depends on the overall demographic situation of the country.
Exactly.
I have Ibrahim kind of commenting, and it's less of a question, but I'm gonna share his comment with you because maybe you want to kind of give a reference on it. So he was basically thinking that this phrasing, non-guaranteed lifetime retirement income, can be worrying to governments and policymakers, right? And he does understand the intention of the OECD to try to differentiate the types of funds, but he feels that could be an area of concern for regulators or even participants. So if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we really struggled what to call this, but we felt there was a need to have a common terminology that can encompass all of these types of arrangements, because for when you go to the UK, for example, if you say collective defined contribution, two people in two different settings can call something a collective defined contribution, but mean completely different things. One is like a DB plan that's offered by the employer and it's involved in the accumulation, and the other one is more it's only for the decumulation of individual account assets. So I think we, as I mentioned, we didn't come up with this name as a selling point. We came up with this name as a way to actually have these discussions and provide education about what these types of plans can involve and the benefits of them. So that is our goal. And after that, we can discuss any potential renames, but I think this will depend on the jurisdiction and their preferences, really. It's cultural as well.
Wonderful, Stephanie. Thank you. If I can please encourage Pablo and Stephanie to join us now. We've got a couple of questions. They're kind of a mix of everything you've spoken about. So if I can encourage you to join us on the screen, then I can direct the questions as I see fit. First of all, I'm really glad we still got about 20 minutes because I want to ask questions. But additionally, I want to salute you for breaking down such a complex, heavy topic so simply and so beautifully in your presentation. So I do want to salute you for doing that. Pablo, I'm going to go over to you because I feel that this question aligns with what you've shared earlier. This question comes from one of our audience members called Amina. And she was basically saying, if we were to look at the big picture of the OECD pension mix and arrangements, it seems that private pensions are really fundamental, right? Judging by the relative size of assets and exceeding GDP. So she's wondering, what could happen in the future to countries continuing to operate a single PAYG pension scheme? So any insights on that, Pablo?
Thank you, and thank you, Amina, for the question. It's very clear for us, and this is one of the key recommendations of the OECD, as I said at the beginning, that it's important to have a multi-pillar system with a diversification of the sources to finance retirement. So the answer is, for us, is straightforward. If you just have a single pay-as-you-go system, you are not going to have the strengths of an asset-backed pension arrangements, and you are going to suffer all the negative aspect of a single pay-as-you-go system.
Perfect. So multi-layered system.
Multi-pillar, yeah, multi-layered system.
And additionally, I think you and Stephanie and Jessica really boosted the idea of the importance of literacy and the importance of communication and the importance of education. So we could be able to kind of build a system that works. Thank you very much for that, Pablo. Stephanie, I'm going to come back to you again because this was a question by Ibrahim. And I know you referred briefly around how the incentivization of employers can come in. And his question really falls on if there are any ideas to nudge employers and governments to move faster with respect to private pensions, anything that we can really push for, especially if we focus on our region.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Ibrahim, for the question. There are a number of things. So I mentioned in the US that they have these financial incentives or this tax credit for small employers. Another type of financial incentive that is actually more common across the OECD is to provide some rebates on the social security contributions when the employer pays contributions to an asset-backed pension system. So basically, they would save in social security contributions if they also contribute to an asset-backed pension, to an occupational pension or to a personal pension plan. So that's one way. Another way that is seems to be quite good, so not really that encouraging, but at making employers feel okay about offering, is there are initiatives in some states of the United States where some states are obliging employers to offer an automatic enrollment pension plan. But this obligation comes with a lot of things that are done easy for the employer. So basically, the plan is already established, so they don't need to establish the pension plan. It is established by the state itself. The employer just needs to enroll into the program with the details of the employees that they have. And this enrollment into the system, into the program is really easy, is online, is very straightforward for employers. And then the only responsibility that lies on the employer's shoulder is to deduct and channel the employee contribution, which the employer knows how to do because they already do that for the social security contributions. And there are studies showing that the employers in those states that are implementing this are very happy with the system because they clearly said it was easy and it is helping my employees to save. So they are happy to be involved in this way, rather than when they have to do everything that by themselves. So making things easier, financial incentive on one side, and making things easier on the other side. And the multi-employer aspect also is important, because then instead of having to do everything by yourself alone, you can pool some of the resources and remove some of the burden on small employers, for example.
That's actually a very interesting point, the area of multi-employer, because essentially, like you said, correctly said, there are smaller employers that probably won't be able to handle that kind of operational setup. So essentially, it could be a very valuable solution. Thank you so much for that, Stephanie. Jessica, I'm going to move over to you. And your non-guaranteed lifetime retirement proposition kind of is raising a bunch of concerns and questions, if I will. So one of them is around what is the impact of that setup on longer term economic outcomes? So that's a question from Mohammed from the audience.
Longer term economic outcomes, I think. Well, it's not for the individual, you mean, or more broadly?
I assume he would refer to the individual, because when I read the question as well, I felt like the impact on an economic outcome on a GDP or on a global level might be a little bit difficult. Yeah.
So for the individual, I mean, as opposed to, well, there's a trade-off with this plan. Because there are no guarantees, it's more sustainable, but also those guarantees don't need to be hedged. That means the assets can be invested to earn higher expected returns on average. But that also means there is a chance that the investment returns will not be sufficient to pay the expected benefits. So these can be, so the resulting benefits could be reduced. But on average, and I think Stephanie has done some work on this as well, so maybe she could share her insights with you. But if you're investing in higher growth assets in the long term, that's probably still makes you better off in the long term than investing in very conservative government bonds. So net, you have to accept that there is a risk of volatility, a risk that your benefits will be reduced. But on average, if you get to invest in higher growth assets, you'll be better off than you otherwise.
Thank you so much. Stephanie, did you have any contributions to the same question?
Well, I think Jessica said it all. So indeed, we have done a study. We are actually doing a study on the contribution of capital markets to DC outcomes, to outcomes from defined contribution pension plans where you have no guarantees. And indeed, when you invest in high risk assets like equities, your expectation will be much higher in terms of the pension benefit you can get. But as always, there is a trade-off, and the trade-off is that you have to accept more volatility. So yes, on average, you will be better off. But if you don't like volatility, then you should have some dose of conservative as well. So having a mix between equities and bonds is probably the best. So diversification is clearly a good option.
Diversification, the 101 of financial literacy. That's very valuable. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Jessica. Pablo, I'm going to go over to you. And this is a question by Ms. Sanat with us on the audience. And she's really referring to more of a very specific area, so the Palestinian territories. And she's explaining to us around how the Palestinian Pension Fund has a clear kind of law that basically focuses on employees working in the public sector. And her question to you, Pablo, if you will, how can you suggest to encourage the private sector to get involved into the pension schemes, especially because apparently in Palestine they only have a defined benefit and defined contribution according to the inputs of Sanat. So if you have any inputs there, Pablo, it will be very helpful.
Thank you for the question. This is not only an issue in Palestine, it's also an issue in other countries. We have decisions on Southeast Asia countries. Obviously, our main recommendations is that this type of provident funds or plans should exist for private sector workers as well. We do not understand and this is one of the key messages on the OECD recommendation for the good design of DC pension plans. We don't understand why some workers have to have plans and others don't. It should be covered, or at least the availability should be for everybody, because otherwise it creates some kind of the haves and the have-nots.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Then maybe I can have a follow-up question with you, Pablo, because again, it seems to be directed towards another country in the region. This is a question from Ahmed, who's speaking about the difficulties that the Egyptian Pension Fund is going through in terms of cash flows and fiscal sustainability. And his question was, how can you help? But I'm not sure that's the question I want to ask. The question I do want to ask is, what would be your recommendations from the work that you've done in terms of kind of getting out of a difficult situation when it comes to pensions?
The first thing is to understand why they have come into a difficult situation, because obviously the solution will be different depending on what is the mechanism or the source of the problem. Let's make an example that has been common in the past, and you ask a question to Stephanie about DBs and DCs. Well, sometimes in defined benefits, which individuals value that enormously because you have a certainty on what you're going to get, the materialization of the macroeconomic variables behind all the actuarial calculations to determine how much you will get, well, they don't materialize exactly, and they are not adjusted regularly. So you might end up in a situation in which the contributions, the life expectancy, the returns that have existed over the last 30 to 40 years have not accumulated enough assets to cover what you have promised. And then you might have some kind of detachment between what you have to pay and what you have been receiving over time. Obviously, the solution there is, well, you need to have a more flexible approach to match what you are promising and the contribution. So sort of like actuarial adjustments to the macroeconomic, economic, and demographic realities that happen.
That's a very well articulated answer, Pablo. I was waiting to see the answer to that question. Very well articulated. Thank you so much. I would like to remind the audience, now that I'm like on a countdown of 7 minutes, I would like to remind the audience that all the speakers' profiles are available on the website. Additionally, the access to the report, which in my opinion is a very, very valuable piece of work, you can freely download it or read it off the OECD website, and the link is also available on the website of FinTech Robos. And the speakers here are very, very generous, so they've been entertaining my questions. So in case you do have anything, I'm sure there is a way to connect with them if they would allow it. I am on a countdown of 5 minutes. I just want to make sure that as I end, I hear from you. So if there are any closing remarks, we can take a round. Pablo, you referred within your speech on the importance of, ESG, digitalization, that sort of element. So if you have any closing remarks with that, quite briefly, and we'll take a round around the audience just to make sure, because I've made sure we've answered everything on the chat as well.
Well, obviously, I would like to promote the work that the three of us, plus other people that work with us, have done. The other publication in which we talk a lot about how to use assets earmarked for retirement, and we look from two angles: the angle of the regulatory framework to make sure that, yes, we say that they should be used to promote growth and sustainable investment, but always in the best interest of members. So the regulatory framework, all the governance and all those issues are very important, but also we talk about the fact that, well, there are different types of pension funds, small, medium size, big. They might have good investment teams. Others cannot afford to have good investment teams. So the availability of appropriate investment vehicles to invest in sustainable investment in infrastructure, in ESG, it becomes quite important. And to develop those type of suitable investment vehicles is essential.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Pablo. Stephanie, your closing remarks?
Well, just like this in the blue. I think it's important to leverage on the advantages that can be provided by employers in the provision of retirement savings or asset-backed pensions. And to do that, you need to understand that for employers, it's also a lot of work. It's also a cost that is involved. And so bearing that in mind, it's important for countries to have this regulatory framework that ensures that things are safe, like Pablo insisted also in his presentation. And at the same time, making sure that you have some flexibility and that you have some easy doing processes to make life easier for employers if you really want to have a good take up on that side.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Jessica?
Sure. I guess related to my presentation, I think these types of arrangements do have a lot of potential, and they have the potential to increase retirement incomes and mitigate some of the risk for individuals. But I think one of the biggest challenges that needs to be overcome, that hasn't yet been overcome, is the challenge of communication, and getting people to understand the benefits and the importance of having this kind of longevity protection and income in retirement. I think a lot of efforts still need to be made on this front. We don't have all the answers of how to overcome that, so we welcome further discussions on different approaches that you have taken as well.
That's stunning. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen from the audience, thank you for being with us this morning. We've been joined by Mr. Pablo Antolin, Ms. Stephanie Payet, and Ms. Jessica Mosher, who joined us from the OECD, and I was very, very honored to have this discussion with you. One of the key things that FinTech Robos and my work in the region has been trying to do is to promote financial awareness, to really build up on the literacy levels. And your contributions today have really helped us set another brick into that wall. We're really trying to build it so that we can address the challenges, we can address the opportunities, and essentially be able to grow as well within the region. I do very much want to thank you for your time. And additionally, I want to thank you for taking such a broad topic into such valuable presentations. The team here are available on LinkedIn. I personally follow their work. They generally have very, very nice insights for anybody who's interested. And essentially the report as well is online. Pablo, Stephanie, Jessica from Bahrain, we're sending you a lot of love. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for a wonderful job as a moderator.
You're very, very kind. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you for
the
opportunity.